Ms. Saldana, you recently reported to the Senate that 121 illegal aliens that have been released by ICE between fiscal year 2010 and 2014 have been arrested for homicide since they were released. How many total homicides have these 121 individuals been charged with? Can you hit your microphone, please?
Beyond the specific information we provided with respect to the homicide, I think we broke down the information. I can't tell you whether there were other homicides involved.
So you just know that those folks have been charged with a homicide, but it doesn't rule out that they could have been charged with multiple homicides. Is that correct?
I can't say we're sitting here today that that's not the case.
And do you know at this point how many convictions have resulted from those charges?
No, I don't.
Is that something that you're interested in finding out?
Certainly. I think we have, as the Inspector General has pointed out, we're working on our systems to try to be more flexible and responsive. We get a lot of inquiries in all shapes and sizes, which we're trying to make our information system more flexible, and that's taken a little time. But yes, absolutely, we're interested in that information, like I know you are, sir.
Do you know if any of those individuals had been convicted of a homicide-related offense before they were released by DHS?
I do not have that information. I don't believe that's the case.
But that's obviously something that's important to know. What, if any, changes does ICE plan on making in light of the fact that you do have 121 individuals who were in ICE custody, were in the country illegally, have been released, and now have been charged with committing homicides? And just the way our criminal system works, I mean, most people who get charged end up getting guilty. I mean, let's just, it's probably over 90%. Let's just say it's 60%. That's a lot of people who've been killed. That's a lot of families who've lost loved ones. And they can look at ICE and say, look, had you just done your job better, maybe my family member would be here today. So what policy changes are you going to make to prevent that from happening in the future?
And I will say that is particularly disturbing, I know, to all the members of this committee and to myself as a prior U.S. attorney in North Texas and Dallas-based. That is something that we're always trying to do, is to find criminals and to convict them. As a result, when I first came here—
Well, and you probably did that very well. I know people on the state level in Texas and other places do it very well. The problem, though, is if they're going and they're being convicted, and then ICE knows that they're not here legally, and we know they're convicts, and yet they still get released into society. In 2013, I know you weren't ICE director then, 2013, DHS released 36,000 individuals who were in the country illegally, had been convicted of crimes. They provided the crimes to us, and they included homicide, they included rape, they included drug trafficking, some very, very serious offenses. 2014, you had 30,000 individuals, again, who were in the country illegally, convicted of crimes, and yet still released by DHS. And so the local and federal law enforcement officers and the prosecutors, they play an important role. But if DHS is then going to release people who've been proven to be a danger to society into the public, well, then that leaves more Americans to be victimized by, in some cases, very violent crimes.
And that's why, Mr. Chairman, I established a procedure that I announced back in March for greater oversight over the release of any person who had a serious prior conviction. In particular, I'm asking people to sign off a piece of paper, the original person who makes the determination with respect to either custody or bond. I'm asking their supervisors to review it. I've actually put together a panel in headquarters which looks over all of these decisions to determine whether or not they were based on the facts and circumstances known to the individual and that they were right decisions. As I mentioned earlier,
And if they're not right decisions, what happens? Because I mentioned the 36,000 in fiscal year 2013. So these are folks that have been convicted in our courts of, in many cases, very serious offenses. They weren't in the country legally. They're released. And now, even at this point in 2015, of those 36,000, by DHS's own figures, 1,000 of those people have already been convicted of new crimes again in the future. And so clearly there is a breakdown there. So when that is not followed, what happens? Who is held accountable? Does anybody lose their job?
It could be, sir. We'll just have to see.
Has anyone lost their job since you've been ICE director?
Not yet. No, not in the
So
6 months.
So the 1,000 new convictions that we've seen for people who had already been convicted, there's not been any accountability within ICE for that. To me, that's a major failure, because if I were somebody whose family member was victimized by a crime, I would want to know, well, wait a minute, you guys should have known the president's policy is, we're going to go after the criminals, zero tolerance, we're going to make it happen, and yet that hasn't happened. So what do you say to the families who've seen who've been victimized?
If I may, sir, I would say that those are tragedies, and I wish that our deportation officers and others making these decisions were omniscient and could see into the future and into the heart and soul of these individuals. But we go by the facts that we know.
Criminal conviction for, say, aggravated assault, that's not looking into the future, that's looking into the past. I mean, as a prosecutor, if you have people who run afoul with the law and get convicted of violent criminal activity, those are people that are much more likely to commit crimes in the future than somebody who's never committed a crime in their life. So it's not just saying that this is all just trying to look into the future and you need clairvoyance. You can judge whether somebody's a threat to society based on their past conduct.
If you'll allow me to finish my answer, Mr. Chairman, I would really appreciate it, because I think the American people have a right to know the full picture here. Every decision we make, there is not a single deportation officer or other agent within ERO who wants to let a dangerous criminal out in the streets to threaten the public. I can guarantee and assure you of that. They are law enforcement officers. And with respect to the ability, we've got to look at the record as it is. We don't look at one single factor. We do look at the age of just like a court of law, the federal courts in which I practiced. They look at many different factors and determine whether to release an individual. And we are bound by some of the numbers that you threw out by the Supreme Court in its decision with respect to not being able to detain people beyond 6 months typically, and the immigration courts that set bond and release some of these folks as well. So that is the complete picture, and that's what I can assure you of, is I'm committed, and I have been doing this since I stepped into this position back in January, to keep that number down and to try to avoid future tragedies like the ones you've described.
Point taken. Now, you said that there are multiple factors, so you can't just look at one thing. So maybe someone has a blemish on their criminal record, but there's other factors. You mentioned age. Answer me this, because there have been people that have been convicted of sexual assault who have been released, and by ICE's own admission, it wasn't because the 6 months was up. Sometimes that happens, but there are other people who did not, where they were discretionary releases. So what other factors would outweigh a conviction for a sexual assault against a woman or a child? And why would we want that person in our society?
This Congress, and in this elaborate system that we're talking about, has entitled the individuals to bond and have said things like the age of the criminal conviction, the nature of the crime.
No, I understand that, but how does that outweigh the seriousness of the offense when you're talking about people who've committed sexual assaults, crimes against children, crimes against women? That's what I don't understand. I understand if somebody got a speeding ticket or something, but some of those, I think there's broad agreement in the American public that that is not something that we want to see where ICE is facilitating people to go back on the street. Now, I'm over my time, so I appreciate you answering the questions. I know some other of my colleagues will have more, and I am going to now recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.